The music had gone soft, that slow kind of soft that makes a room feel smaller, and I noticed Vanessa Marchetti's hands shaking before I noticed anything else about her. It was the kind of holiday party that the company spent too much money on, the kind where everyone in finance grumbles about the catering bill the next week but shows up anyway in their good coat. The venue was a renovated warehouse near the waterfront in Halifax, exposed brick and string lights, the kind of place that looked good in the company's year-end newsletter photos. Wine glasses clinked. Someone's kid had snuck in and was sliding across the dance floor in socks before being scooped up by an embarrassed parent. And there, near the edge of it all, stood the woman who'd made me dread Monday mornings for the better part of a year, looking like she might actually fall over. Before I tell you what happened next, if stories about second chances and the people who change us when we least expect it mean something to you, stick around. Leave a comment if you've ever had a boss you misjudged completely. It helps more than you'd think. My name is Marcus Whitlow, and 2 years ago I was 3 weeks from quitting the best job I'd ever had. Not because the work was bad, because I was convinced my boss couldn't stand the sight of me. I grew up outside Sudbury, Ontario, in a house where money was something you talked about in low voices after the kids were supposed to be asleep. My dad drove a delivery route for a regional grocery chain, the kind of job where you're on your feet from 5 in the morning and your knees give out by 50. My mom did the books for a couple of small businesses in town, cash under the table some months when things got tight. They didn't have much to give me except one piece of advice, repeated so often it became a kind of family scripture. When you get a chance, you don't waste it feeling sorry for yourself. So when I landed a position as a financial analyst at Marchetti Strategic Group, a mid-sized consulting firm with a real reputation across the Maritimes, I felt like I'd finally gotten my chance. I'd worked retail through university, then 2 years at a credit union doing nothing that used my degree, and suddenly I had a desk on the 14th floor with a view of the harbor and a manager whose name people said with a strange mixture of respect and Vanessa Marchetti wasn't just my boss. She was the founder's daughter, and by the time I joined, she'd taken over running the place herself after her father stepped back. People called her the ice queen behind her back, not unkindly exactly, more like the way you'd describe weather you respected. She was sharp, decisive, allergic to small talk. I never once saw her eat lunch with anyone. Her office door was glass, so you could always see her in there, but it might as well have been a vault. The first time she reviewed one of my reports, she found 4 errors in formatting and 1 in my underlying assumptions, and she told me about all 5 without once raising her voice or once softening it either. I went home that night and told my roommate I'd made a huge mistake taking the job. That was month 1. By month 6, it hadn't gotten better. If anything, it had gotten worse, because by then I'd started to believe the coldness was personal. Other analysts got the occasional nod, the rare good work tossed over a shoulder. I got silence, or worse, that careful, surgical way she had of dismantling an idea without ever raising her voice. Her emails to me were never longer than 2 sentences. I started reading into the punctuation, if you can believe that. A period instead of an exclamation point felt like evidence. My savings were thin. Rent in Halifax wasn't cheap, and I was still paying down a chunk of student debt that never seemed to shrink no matter how many extra payments I threw at it. I told myself if I couldn't make this job work, with the salary and the benefits and the actual career trajectory it offered, then maybe I just wasn't cut out for this kind of work at all. One rainy Tuesday in November, sitting in my apartment with my laptop open, I started drafting my resignation letter. I didn't finish it. I closed the laptop, told myself I'd sleep on it, and went to bed feeling like a failure with good Wi-Fi. 2 days later, the firm's holiday party landed on the calendar, mandatory in that unspoken way Canadian offices have of making attendance mandatory without ever using the word. I almost didn't go. I went anyway, in the one decent blazer I owned, mostly because I figured free food was free food and I needed something to take my mind off the letters still sitting unfinished in my drafts folder. The warehouse venue was already loud by the time I arrived, that particular hum of 100 coworkers trying to remember how to be people outside a Slack channel. I got a drink, found a spot near the back, and tried to make myself small. Vanessa arrived almost 40 minutes late, which wasn't like her, and when she walked in, the room did that thing rooms do around certain people, a kind of involuntary recalibration. She wore a dark green dress, simple, nothing flashy, and somehow it didn't matter what she wore because it was never really about that with her. It was the way she carried the air around her. But something was off. I noticed it within seconds. Her shoulders were too high. Her jaw set in that way you only catch on someone if you've spent a year studying their face for clues about whether you're about to get fired. She kept glancing toward the exit, not in the bored, ready to leave way, in the trapped way. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that for almost 20 minutes, nursing a drink I didn't really want, while the band, a local three-piece the company hired every year, started into something slow. Couples drifted onto the floor, a few coworkers, a couple of the senior partners with their spouses. And there was Vanessa, standing completely alone at the edge of the room, the one person in the building nobody would dream of approaching. I don't fully know what made me do it. I've turned it over 100 times and since. Maybe it was that I had nothing left to lose 3 weeks from quitting anyway. Maybe it was something simpler, the plain fact that nobody should look that alone in a room full of people who worked for her. Whatever it was, I put my drink down, crossed the floor, and held out my hand. She looked at me like I'd spoken to her in a language she didn't recognize. For a second, I thought she'd just say no, turn back to the window, and I'd have to find some way to disappear into the crowd with what was left of my dignity. Then she put her hand in mine. We stepped onto the floor and the music seemed to drop a register, the way it does when you stop hearing the room and start only hearing the person across from you. People glanced over. I caught a couple of raised eyebrows. Somebody's quiet double take. I didn't care. What I cared about, what I noticed almost immediately, was that her hand was trembling. Not a polite, mild nervousness. An actual tremor, the kind you feel right through your palm. When she finally lifted her eyes to mine, there was something in them I had never once seen in a year of working under her. Fear. Not performance, not a tactic, just plain fear. The kind that belongs to someone who has been holding a weight by themselves for far too long. For the first time since I'd met her, Vanessa Marchetti looked like a person instead of a closed door. Neither of us said anything for a while. The band kept playing, something unhurried with a lot of space between the notes, and we just moved slow, careful, like two people figuring out an unfamiliar staircase in the dark. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, tight as a gyre. I realized with a strange in my stomach that the woman everyone in the building was a little afraid of was standing 2 feet from me, completely undone. Her eyes flicked up again, and something in her face shifted, small, almost nothing, but enough that I caught it. Like a crack opening in something that had been sealed a long time. Behind it wasn't anger. It was loneliness, the deep, settled kind that doesn't come from a bad week. The kind that builds over years of nobody asking if you're all right, because everyone assumes you don't need asking. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that much from my mother, who used to say some kinds of comfort don't need words, they just need you to stay put. So I stayed put, let the music carry us, and waited. After a long stretch of silence, Vanessa took a breath that looked like it cost her something. When she spoke, her voice had none of the edges I was used to. It was quiet, almost unsteady. She told me that 2 hours before the party, she'd taken a phone call from their largest client, a shipping and logistics company out of St. John that accounted for close to 40% of the firm's annual billings. They were pulling out. Effective immediately, no warning, a decision made above the head of the person Vanessa had worked with for 6 years. Just like that, 6 years of relationship building and strategy work, gone in a 4-minute phone call. She said it without drama, in the flat, tired voice of someone reciting a casualty count. The board would need an emergency meeting before the new year. There'd be questions about layoffs, about whether the firm could make payroll through the next 2 quarters without that account. And she was the one who'd have to walk into that boardroom and explain how she planned to fix something that, as far as she could tell in that moment, might not be fixable. I felt something shift in my chest as she talked. The thing I'd been carrying around for months, the conviction that my problems were the only problems in that building, started to look small and a little embarrassing next to what she was describing. I told her, before I really decided to tell her anything, that I'd thought she hated me. That I'd been sitting at home 2 nights before, actually writing my resignation letter, because I figured I wasn't good enough for this place and never would be. She went still. For a second I thought I'd overstepped badly, said something that would cost me whatever strange grace had brought us onto that dance floor in the first place. Then she shook her head, slow, like she was working something out as she did it. She said she'd noticed my work since my first month, that the silence I'd mistaken for disdain had actually been her own way of pushing, because she'd seen something in my early reports worth pushing toward. She said she'd never been good at praise, that her father had run the company the same way, that compliments felt to her like letting your guard down in front of people who might use it against you later. She'd been harder on me, she said, because she thought I had the kind of mind that could eventually run a department, maybe more, and she didn't want to waste that by being gentle. Hearing it felt like a window opening in a room I'd assumed was sealed shut for good. Then her voice dropped lower and she told me she'd seen my resignation letter. Not finished, not sent, just the draft, still open on my monitor when she'd walked past my desk earlier that week on her way to a meeting, the screen unlocked because I'd stopped for 2 minutes to grab coffee and forgotten to lock it like an idiot. She hadn't said anything. She'd just kept walking, and she said that was part of why she'd looked the way she did when she walked into the party. Not only the lost contract, the thought that someone she'd been quietly betting on might be about to walk out the door without her ever having told him why she'd been so hard on him in the first place. The song was winding down, that last slow turn before the band let it go, and she didn't step back right away. She held still for a second longer than she needed to, and then very quietly she said the thing I still think about more than I'd like to admit. She said she wasn't asking me to stay for the company. She was asking me to stay, period. Because in 2 years of running this place essentially alone, she'd gotten very good at being feared and very bad at being trusted, and somewhere in the last 6 months, without meaning to, she'd started trusting me, and that scared her more than the lost client did. "Please don't leave me," she said. "Not the firm. Me. I'd be lying if I told you I had some perfectly composed response ready. I didn't. I just stood there for a second with her hand still in mine, the band packing up their instruments around us, half the room already drifting back toward the bar. What I told her, eventually, was that I wasn't going anywhere. Not because the job had suddenly gotten easier, or because the fear of being unemployed in this economy had eased up any. I told her I was staying because some things are easier to face with someone beside you than alone, and I figured we'd both been doing this alone for too long, just for different reasons. The months after that were some of the hardest the firm had ever been through. Losing that client forced a restructuring nobody wanted to do. There were layoffs, 2 rounds of them, conversations I sat in on that I'll never forget, watching good people pack up desks they'd had for a decade. There were nights Vanessa and I were still in the office past 11, going over projections with cold coffee between us, trying to find a version of the next 18 months that didn't end in the firm closing entirely. But something else was happening underneath all of that. Vanessa started asking for ideas instead of issuing decisions. She brought junior staff into meetings they wouldn't have been invited to a year earlier. She started saying thank you, not performatively, just plainly. The way you'd thank someone for passing the salt, except it clearly cost her something every time. And you could tell she meant it more because of that. Once, in February, I caught her actually laughing at something one of the interns said in a meeting, and 3 people in the room exchanged looks like they'd witnessed a solar eclipse. It's been almost 2 years now since that party. Marchetti's strategic group came through the other side of it, but steadier, picked up 2 new clients out of Ontario within the first year, expanded into a service line they'd been talking about for ages but never had the bandwidth to launch. Vanessa is still demanding. She still doesn't suffer sloppy work, and she still has that reputation around the office, the one people half respect and half fear. But now there's a second half to how people describe her, the part where they mention she actually listens, that she remembers what's going on in your life, that she shows up. I'm not going to pretend this turned into some neat office romances, because it didn't, not in the way you might be hoping. What it turned into was something harder to put a name on, a kind of loyalty that doesn't show up much in job descriptions. I've had 3 recruiters reach out to me in the last year with offers that paid more. I turned all of them down without much hesitation, and not because I owe Vanessa anything in some debt repayment sense, because I learned something on that dance floor I don't think I'd have learned anywhere else, which is that the people who seem the strongest are often just the ones who've gotten the best at hiding how tired they are, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do for somebody isn't fixing their problem. It's just not walking away while they figure it out. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's that the people who scare you most at work are very rarely the villains you've built them up to be in your head. Sometimes they're just exhausted in a way they've never been allowed to show, waiting for somebody to notice, even once, even just for the length of one slow song.